She stood completely still, too still for a child her age. In the middle of the changing of the guard, while hundreds watched the ceremony unfold, one little girl wasn't watching the soldiers. She was watching one man. And when their eyes finally met, she did something no one expected. What happens when a royal guard, trained to never break formation, sees a silent signal most people would miss? Would he risk everything, his career, his command, to protect a child he's never met? This is not a story about ceremony. It's about the moment a child found her voice and a soldier who chose to hear it. The square outside Buckingham Palace shimmered in the early morning light. Tourists lined the black iron gates, holding up their phones and pointing excitedly as the changing of the guard ceremony began. The brass band struck the opening note, boots moved in perfect rhythm, and all around, children squealed with laughter, some perched on their parents' shoulders. But one child didn't move at all. 7-year-old Emily Carter stood near the front of the crowd, close to the gate, arms by her side. Her body was too still for a child her age. No bouncing on toes, no pointing fingers, no wide-eyed awe, just a pair of small shoes anchored to the cobblestone and a gaze that never wandered far from the tall soldier in red standing across from her. Sergeant James Whittaker had served 12 years in the Queen's Guard. He'd stood through rain, snow, protests, and parades. He'd learned to read crowds like a battlefield. It was never just about standing still. It was about watching without being seen. And from the moment he spotted the girl in the pale blue coat, something didn't sit right. She wasn't just quiet. She was tense. Her arms were stiff at her sides, hands clenched just enough to notice, and her eyes, they were fixed on him like he was the only safe thing in the square. Behind her stood a man, tall, well-dressed, maybe mid-40s, who kept one hand on the girl's shoulder. Not in a protective way, but firm, possessive, like he was holding a leash, not a child. When a passing couple tried to strike up conversation, he cut them off with a look sharp enough to freeze the air. Whittaker had seen that look before. Not on parade grounds, but in places where children weren't safe. Still, he said nothing. The rules were strict. No movement, no reaction, just the rhythm of duty. But his eyes kept returning to the girl. The long sleeves on a warm morning. The way she flinched when the trumpet player stepped forward. The way her body leaned slightly away from the man behind her, even as he tightened his grip. Whittaker scanned the crowd, checking angles, spacing, exits, instincts honed in uniform kicking in beneath the polished surface of ceremony. He couldn't act on a feeling. But he could remember details. The man's watch, the bag over his shoulder. The way Emily's fingers tapped 3 times against her leg when the man turned his head. Not random, not childlike, a rhythm with intention. The ceremony continued. The guards shifted position, brass gleamed in the sun, and the crowd moved as one body, cheering, recording, unaware. All except for Emily and Whittaker. Locked in a silent line of sight that no one else could see. And just like that, the clock had started ticking. From a distance, Richard Morgan looked like any other attentive parent. He wore a tailored coat, nodded politely at passing tourists, and even offered a thin smile when someone's child brushed past him. But that smile never reached his eyes, and his hand, still clamped on Emily's shoulder, never loosened. James Whittaker remained still in his ceremonial posture, but his mind tracked every movement between the man and the child. Emily stood half a step in front of Richard, yet her posture spoke volumes. Her shoulders were tight, her neck stiff. When a curious boy next to her giggled and pointed at the guards, she didn't react. Only her eyes flicked sideways, and when Richard noticed, he leaned in and whispered something close to her ear. She froze. Whittaker couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The tone, the timing, the change in Emily's breathing, it all told the same story. Control wasn't being kept by kindness. It was being enforced by quiet threat. A few feet away, Walter and Joanne Fisher watched the interaction unfold. Retired school teachers in their 70s, they had come from Ohio to celebrate their anniversary. Joanne had spent decades teaching 2nd grade. She'd seen the signs too many times to miss them now. The way Emily's sleeves covered her wrists, how she kept her hands hidden, how she blinked too often without ever shedding a tear. Walter placed a gentle hand on his wife's arm. They both knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what they could do yet. When another tourist reached down to compliment Emily's coat, Richard stepped forward, not rudely, but firmly enough to end the exchange. "She's shy," he said, voice flat. His hand returned to her back. Emily didn't look up. She didn't look at anyone, except for one person. Her gaze drifted again toward Whitaker, and he saw it. The hesitation in her breathing, the small, imperceptible shuffle of her feet away from the man's shadow, the way her fingers curled into her palm. Whitaker's training didn't prepare him for this exact moment, but it had given him the tools. Combat had taught him to read terrain. His years in ceremonial service had trained him to read silence. And what he saw now wasn't a quiet child enjoying a public event. It was a quiet plea for someone, anyone, to notice. The parade continued. Brass filled the air. Tourists clapped. But in one corner of the square, a different kind of performance was unfolding. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was no less urgent. And Whitaker knew if the child needed help, it wouldn't come with a scream. It would come with something much quieter, if he was paying close enough attention. The warmth of the morning sun settled over the square, but near the palace gates, something felt colder. Not in temperature, but in tension. Amid the laughter and selfies, a few quiet observers had started to sense it too. Joanne Fisher noticed it first. She leaned slightly toward her husband Walter and murmured, "She hasn't moved once, Walt." "Not once." Walter followed her gaze to the little girl in the blue coat. Emily Carter. While children nearby clapped and pointed at the marching guards, Emily stood with her arms locked to her sides, her face expressionless, as if every smile had been taught out of her. Richard Morgan, the man behind her, kept a hand firmly on her shoulder. His stance didn't suggest comfort. It suggested possession. He never looked at the guards or the crowd, only at Emily. When she leaned ever so slightly forward, captivated by the vibrant uniforms, he tugged her back. Just enough to remind her. Just enough that it wouldn't be noticed unless you were watching closely. But now people were. Joanne's instincts from her decades as an elementary school teacher stirred uneasily. She had seen children who hid bruises under sweaters. She had heard their excuses about bumping into tables or falling off bikes. And now, looking at Emily, she saw the same quiet armor. Sandra Wells, a retired social worker standing just to their right, felt it too. She had worked with children in crisis for most of her life. Her eyes were trained to catch the moments others dismissed. The way Emily's sleeve had slid up briefly when she reached for the rail, revealing a shadow that looked like a fading bruise. The way she pulled it back down immediately. The way she didn't speak, didn't blink much, didn't move unless prompted. Then came the clearest sign yet. As the guards began their synchronized rifle spin, one of them shouted a command. Sharp, loud, intended for ceremony. Dozens of children giggled at the sudden burst of noise. But Emily didn't. She flinched, not just a little. Her body recoiled as if she'd been struck. Richard reacted fast, too fast. He crouched beside her, hand curling around her wrist, whispering something so close to her ear it couldn't be heard. His lips were tight, his jaw clenched. Emily stood still again, shoulders rising slightly with every breath, but no sound came from her. Whitaker, still holding ceremonial position, saw it all. His heart pressed against his ribs, his training screaming at him to wait, to stay and roll. But that moment of fear on Emily's face, the silent flinch, had shifted something. This wasn't imagined. This wasn't overthinking. It was real. And somewhere inside the crowd, a slow awareness began to ripple. The people closest to the pair weren't just watching a royal tradition anymore. They were witnessing something else, something troubling. The music swelled, the guards turned, the rhythm of ceremony moved forward, but the eyes of several strangers, now locked on one child and one man, refused to look away. It happened in less than 2 seconds. As the guard unit shifted formation and the crowd turned to follow the movement, Richard Morgan leaned down to adjust the strap on his leather bag. His hand left Emily's back for the first time since they'd arrived. In that brief moment, she did something so subtle, most people wouldn't have noticed. But James Whitaker did. Her right hand lifted slowly toward her chest. She closed her fingers over her thumb, then folded her fist inward. It was deliberate, controlled, and unmistakable. The universal distress signal. A silent cry that's been taught in schools and shared on public service videos. A sign designed for moments exactly like this, when speaking out loud would be dangerous, and when silence might be the only option left. Whitaker's pulse spiked, but his face remained stoic. No movement, no change in posture. But behind his stillness, every nerve had lit up. The child was signaling abuse, and she had just chosen him to see it. Emily didn't look at him after she made the sign. She lowered her hand, eyes downcast, as if nothing had happened. But Whitaker had already made up his mind. That one gesture broke the barrier between ceremony and duty, between performance and protection. He quickly scanned the crowd again, calculating distances and routes. Richard Morgan was starting to stand upright, tugging the bag over his shoulder, hand drifting back toward the girl's arm. The time to act was now. Whitaker's voice didn't rise. He didn't call for help. Instead, he made a precise, intentional turn, breaking protocol, and took his first step off the ceremonial line. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones lowered. Conversations froze. A guard never moves without command, and certainly not toward the spectators. But Whitaker moved with quiet force. Each step measured, cutting through the stunned onlookers like a blade through water. Across the square, Joanne Fisher grasped her husband's hand tightly. "He saw something," she whispered. "He's doing something." Emily glanced up, and for the first time her face changed. Not fully. Not relief, but something in her shoulders loosened. She knew he had understood. Richard noticed too. His hand clenched tighter around the strap. His eyes darted left, right, measuring his options. His grip found Emily's wrist again, more forceful this time. "Let's go," he muttered. But it was already too late, because now all eyes were watching. And Emily wasn't alone anymore. The sound of boots on stone echoed sharply as James Whitaker advanced, out of line, out of formation, and fully aware of what that meant. Behind him, the other guards remained rigid, but the crowd shifted, murmurs rising like a wave. Something had changed. This was no longer part of the ceremony. Richard Morgan immediately sensed the shift. His posture tensed. He grabbed Emily's arm, firmer this time, and began pulling her back toward the edge of the crowd. "We're leaving," he snapped under his breath. But Emily hesitated. Her feet dragged slightly against the pavement, eyes locked on the man in uniform walking toward her like a wall of resolve. Whitaker stopped just a few feet away. Not close enough to escalate, but close enough to intercept. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he spoke clearly, with the weight of authority that didn't need volume. "Sir, step back. That child just issued a recognized distress signal. I need to speak with her." The crowd around them had fallen almost entirely silent. Dozens of phones now pointed their way. A few tourists moved aside, creating a narrow circle. Richard's eyes flicked to the lenses, then back to Whitaker. "She's my daughter," he said coldly. "We don't need your performance. Come on, Emily." Whitaker didn't flinch. "I'm not asking." From the side, Walter and Joanne Fisher stepped forward. Joanne's voice cracked as she said, "We've been watching. That little girl hasn't smiled once. She's scared of him." And then came another voice, from behind a phone held steady by Brenda Lawson, a visitor from New York. "I got her doing the signal. I recorded it. It's real." Richard's confidence wavered for the first time. His grip tightened, but Emily didn't move. For the first time that morning, she stood not in fear, but in pause. Then another presence entered the circle. Officer Helen Brooks, retired NYPD and now traveling solo across Europe, stepped forward with calm certainty. She flashed her ID to Whitaker, then turned to Richard. "You're not taking her anywhere," she said. "Not until the police arrive. Not after what I just saw." Richard's jaw clenched. For a second, the old arrogance returned to his face, the assumption that no one would stop him. But now, surrounded by witnesses, cameras, and the unyielding presence of a soldier who had just broken ranks for a child he didn't know, Richard Morgan understood. He was no longer in control. And Emily, still silent, took one step away from him. Emily Carter stood between two worlds, one behind her, tightening its grip, and one in front of her, stepping closer with quiet courage. James Whitaker kept his body angled between Richard and the child, his stance firm, his eyes steady. Years of training had taught him to read tension. But this wasn't war. This was something more delicate, and far more personal. Emily still hadn't spoken. Her eyes flicked from Whitaker to the gathering crowd. Her lips parted, then closed again. The words were there, but fear was louder. That's when Joanne Fisher stepped forward. She didn't shout, she didn't gesture wildly. She simply spoke with the steady voice of someone who had raised children and refused to look away. "I saw it too," she said. "The hand signal. I saw her do it, and I saw him pull her back." Richard tried to brush her off with a forced smile. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you saw." Joanne cut him off, gently but without hesitation. "I saw a child who's afraid, and I saw a man who doesn't want her to speak." Behind her, Walter moved beside his wife, arms crossed, not as a threat, but as quiet reinforcement. Then another voice joined in. "I've got it on video," said Brenda Lawson, holding her phone up without needing to replay it. She made the sign, clear as day, and the moment the guard moved, he grabbed her. Sandra Wells came next. "You can call it whatever you want, but I've worked with abused children for 30 years. And she doesn't need to say a word, her body already has." Richard's face darkened. His hand dropped from Emily's arm, but the damage was done. He looked around and saw something he hadn't anticipated. People weren't averting their eyes anymore. They weren't walking past in silence. They were surrounding him, not with shouts, not with anger, but with calm refusal to let him disappear. Officer Helen Brooks, off duty and blending in until now, stepped through the crowd, badge in hand. "I'm a retired officer from the NYPD. I'd like you to stay right where you are," she said, voice low but absolute. Richard froze. Emily looked up at Whitaker again, and for the first time, her eyes didn't search for an escape. They searched for permission. Whitaker crouched slightly, enough to meet her eye level. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You don't have to be silent anymore." The air around them changed. The crowd no longer buzzed, it listened. Emily took one small breath, then another. Her mouth opened again, and this time the words came. Emily's voice came out soft, barely a whisper, but in the hush that had settled over the square, every word carried like thunder. "He hurts me, all the time." No one moved at first. Richard Morgan didn't blink. His jaw twitched. Then, without warning, he lunged. Not with a yell, not with panic, but with the cold speed of someone used to acting before others could react. His hand shot toward Emily, not to strike, but to silence, to pull her back into control before her words could spread any further. But James Whitaker was ready. He pivoted smoothly, catching Richard's wrist mid-motion and twisting it down in a fluid arc that turned aggression into restraint. One step, one shift of balance, and Richard was face down on the stone pavement, pinned by a soldier who had once disarmed insurgents under fire, and now used that same calm precision to protect a child. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone cursed under their breath, but no one stepped in because they saw it clearly now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't overreaction. This was a takedown years in the making. Emily backed up instinctively, but didn't run. Her hands trembled, but she didn't cry. She just watched. For the first time, the man who had controlled every movement, every word, was no longer standing. Brenda Lawson kept filming but lowered her voice to speak to Emily. "You're brave, honey. You're really brave." Officer Helen Brooks moved in and knelt beside Whitaker. "I've called in a patrol unit," she said, her voice clipped but measured. "We'll hold him here until they arrive." Whitaker nodded, his grip steady. Richard didn't resist now. Not because he accepted what was happening, but because he finally understood there was no one left to protect him. Emily stood a few feet away, flanked by Joanne and Sandra. Her breathing had slowed. Her hands still trembled, but she wasn't shrinking anymore. She wasn't trying to disappear. She had spoken, and someone had answered. Whitaker looked up, eyes meeting hers. "You did the right thing," he said, voice low. "And it's over now. He's not going to hurt you again." Emily didn't respond right away, but she gave a single nod. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but for her, it was a beginning. The sound of sirens cut faintly through the late morning air, not urgent, but steady. Within minutes, 2 security officers arrived at the palace gates, notified by Officer Helen Brooks. The crowd parted once more, this time not in confusion, but in quiet solidarity. They had seen what happened. And now, they stayed to make sure it wouldn't be dismissed. One officer knelt beside Emily, his voice gentle. "Hi there, I'm Officer Harris. We're here for you, okay?" Emily nodded, not speaking this time, but she didn't shrink away. Her posture was different now. Still guarded, but not alone. As Richard Morgan was lifted to his feet and restrained, the evidence began to surface, not in dramatic fashion, but through quiet, careful verification. Brenda Lawson handed over her phone with the video. Sandra Wells offered her written account. Joanne and Walter described what they had seen, down to Richard's tone, the pressure of his grip, and Emily's repeated glances toward the guard. But the most damning evidence of all came when one of the female officers gently rolled back the sleeve of Emily's coat. There, beneath the fabric, were faint, healing bruises in the shape of fingers. A silence fell again, not the uncertain hush from before, but something deeper. A shared understanding that what they feared was true. Officer Brooks stood close to Emily, a quiet presence of reassurance. "You don't have to say anything else," she said. "They see it now. We all do." Richard didn't speak. He didn't resist. But even in cuffs, his face remained cold, unreadable. He glanced once at Emily, not with remorse, but with that same measured calculation. It didn't matter. The power he once held through fear had crumbled. Whitaker remained nearby, standing at ease but alert. His ceremonial posture was gone now, replaced by something simpler, something real. Emily noticed. She took one small step toward him, not for protection, but for grounding. The officers led Richard away, the crowd silent as he passed. Not one person raised a phone, not one person cheered. This wasn't justice to be celebrated, it was harm finally being named and stopped. Emily stood beside Whitaker, her body finally relaxed, though her hands still twisted lightly at the hem of her coat. She looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you." He gave a soft nod, his voice calm. "You did the hard part." As the patrol car drove off, taking Richard beyond the gates, Emily leaned slightly against Officer Brooks. The weight on her shoulders hadn't vanished, but for the first time it wasn't growing heavier. It was being lifted, piece by piece, with every person who chose to see. Weeks passed. Paperwork was filed. Interviews were conducted. Emily Carter stayed under the protective care of Child Services while the legal system moved slowly, as it always does. But one thing had changed. This time, she wasn't waiting alone. James Whitaker visited her every week, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. He didn't bring gifts or make promises. He just sat with her, talked when she wanted to talk, listened when she didn't. And slowly, Emily began to trust the silence again. One afternoon, after a long session with a social worker, Emily asked a question with the kind of simplicity only children can carry. "Can he be my family now?" The process wasn't instant, but by the time autumn leaves began to fall across Hyde Park, the answer was yes. James Whitaker, a lifelong soldier who had learned to hold ground with discipline and silence, signed the papers that made him Emily's guardian, and soon after, her adoptive father. He did it not for ceremony, not to be recognized, but because something in her had shifted, something in him. After years of guarding monuments, he had finally been asked to guard something real. They didn't make a big announcement. There were no photos or celebrations, just a quiet morning. A walk through the same square where it all began. But this time, Emily wasn't tense. She wasn't scanning the crowd or pulling at her sleeves. She was walking beside James, wearing a coat she chose, holding a warm drink in her hands, and smiling when he handed her the guard's hat she'd once admired from behind the gate. They passed by the place where tourists still gathered, where the guards still marched in perfect rhythm. Most people didn't notice them, but a few did. A couple who remembered, a woman who had once filmed, a retired teacher who had returned to London just to see that girl walk freely. And that's where this story ends. Not with applause, not with anger, but with a step forward. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it doesn't punish loudly or heal completely. But it shows up in small ways. In a child who no longer whispers, in a man who breaks rank for the right reasons, and in a quiet walk toward a future that no longer feels so heavy. If you've ever been judged by the way you looked, or felt powerless in the face of someone stronger, remember this. The truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be seen. Comment below. Type 1 if you've ever felt helpless watching someone misuse their power. Type 2 if you believe that kindness, backed by courage, still has the strength to win. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes that silence can be broken, and that doing the right thing is always worth it. For more true stories that remind us what justice and decency look like, subscribe to the channel. We release new videos every week.